Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Michelle Daniel Jones, and I welcome you all to this panel on Pell restoration and racial equity. I am an activist, scholar, and artist, and I would not be where I am today, enrolled in one of the highest rated doctoral programs in the country, able to advise, advocate for, and achieve public policy changes in my state and others, co-found and lead a nonprofit organization that provides quality housing to formerly incarcerated women, just to name a few, only 3 years since my incarceration. Had it not been for faculty and supporters who had my back, who fought for me while I was incarcerated afterwards, my own personal drive, resilience, spiritual grounding, that keeps me awake and teachable. And I would not be here where I am today without access to a higher education while incarcerated. Today, we will be discussing the critical importance of education as a means to liberation for people incarcerated. And at this time, I have the pleasure of introducing Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She represents the 13th District of California. She is the former head of the Congressional Black Caucus and Congressional Progressive Caucus. She is co-chair of the Policy and Steering Committee on the House Democratic Leadership Team. She has been a champion and national leader on racial and economic equity justice issues in Congress. She has been a key ally in the fight to restore Pell, and we're so excited she could join us via video.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I proudly represent California's beautiful 13th Congressional District. I want to thank Equity is Justice for hosting today's panel and thank all of the participants in this event. To expand educational opportunities and address inequality, we must see education as a right that can create a path for those impacted by the criminal justice system. Higher education is proven to reduce recidivism and to secure employment opportunities of justice-involved individuals. Expanding access to Pell Grants would help reduce recidivism and provide educational opportunities for so many who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. Repealing the Pell ban would save states an estimated total of $365.8 million per year as a result of reduced recidivism rates and reincarceration spending. This fight is also about addressing systemic racism and inequality that drives mass incarceration, especially in communities of color. Last year, I introduced the Expanding Educational Opportunities for Justice-Impacted Communities Act with my colleagues in the House. The bill would repeal the ban on the receipt of Pell Grants by incarcerated individuals and the loss of federally financial and eligibility for individuals convicted of certain drug offenses. I will keep fighting for this bill in the House and to expand access to higher education for all, especially communities of color who have been disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration and economic inequality. Education is fundamental to our future. It's a basic human right, and it is past time we treat it as such. Thank you again for your important work and for inviting me to speak with you today.
Wow, powerful. Thank you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Today we'll be discussing what does allyship look like for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and formerly incarcerated communities, and how we can reconcile reinstating Pell and improving conditions of confinement when our ultimate goal is abolition. Equity is Justice is a collaboration of people and organizations that share a mission to center the voices of those directly impacted. Some of the organizations and people include College and Community Fellowship, formerly Incarcerated College Graduates Network, Drug Policy Alliance, VERA, myself, Aaron Corbett, and Second Chance Educational Alliance, as well as others who are formerly incarcerated leading their own organizations to uplift all of those who are impacted by the criminal legal system. And I'm extremely proud to be a part of Equity is Justice Coalition and Unlock Higher Ed. Both coalitions are fighting to restore Pell for thousands of incarcerated students, and our collective work will result in the full restoration of Pell for students desiring to achieve a degree, because we know the power that a credential can provide in countering the collateral consequences of criminal convictions. Our conversation is critically important today in this moment of racial reckoning as well. Let it not be lost on anyone that if racial equity and justice is the goal of any organization, public institution, corporation, or philanthropic organization, the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated must be included and centered in these goals, as we represent that demographic that intersects all categories of marginality and precarity. So this conversation with the brilliant panelists that we have on deck today will also speak to this critical moment that we are in. For your information, hashtag Equity is Justice will be hosting another panel on October 14th on Pell and universal eligibility. Follow us at CCF_NY and stay posted. There will also be a Q&A at the end of this conversation. Drop questions below using the hashtag Equity is Justice, and the team will pull the questions. So now, let's turn to our brilliant panelists and allow them to introduce themselves. Let's start with Terrell.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me be a part of this very timely and important conversation. My name is Terrell Blunt. I represent the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network. I'm an activist for justice reform and Black rights. And under FICGN, we do promote and support post-secondary education attainment for currently and formerly incarcerated people, as well as center our work around that same group and uplifting those voices to achieve change.
Thank you so much, Terrell. Cassandra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Cassandra Frederick. I'm the Executive Director of Drug Policy Alliance. We are a national organization that is working to end the way that society deals with drugs. We see this issue as super important to our work because most times folks think about drugs and they think about people getting arrested and incarcerated, but there are so many different ways that drug charges show up and disrupt people's lives, including the ways that it limits people's access to higher education.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. Dominique Morgan is with us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Executive Director of Black and Pink. We really look at the intersections of LGBTQ plus people, folks who identify as living with HIV and AIDS who have been system impacted in our communities. Ultimately, we want to take folks from a space of surviving to the opportunity to thrive. I'm so excited to be with you all this morning.
Thank you so much, Nick, for being here. And now we have Ms. Vivian Nixon. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship. I do this work in many different ways. I'm a poet, a writer, and I run an organization as well as participate in various networks. And I'm honored to be on this panel with all of you today. It feels like a dream come true. I feel like it's my birthday.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today. So we have an amazing panel to get into. Why don't we just start and get into it? So when we're talking about Pell restoration, there's been different arguments presented on why Pell and what Pell is supposed to do, and what answers it's supposed to provide. I would like for us to have a general conversation, kind of reaching into this conversation about what's the goal of Pell? What are the arguments that we've heard for Pell, and what are your personal beliefs about what Pell is? And we can start with anyone.
So, I mean, as a matter of just plain history and fact, the initiation of Pell Grants in 1965 was a federal grant program to low-income students who would typically not be able to afford to go to college. In 1972, that eligibility was expanded to include incarcerated students. The the discussion around Pell became a national conversation in 1994 when the 1994 crime bill made those students incarcerated ineligible. And the framing for bringing it back started out in the same framing as most other reentry programs, that this providing people with these services would help them reintegrate into society by better access to jobs and higher income, sustained housing, all of the things that we crafted a narrative around reentry in 2004. We did it consciously. I was part of that problem. However, over the years, what I'm framing this as a reckoning of the fact that Black and brown people, but particularly Black people, have been denied access to legislation, to education through the legislation process for 400 years. We're the only population that in many states it was illegal to teach us basic literacy. So for me, it really is a matter of equity and racial justice.
Terrell, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that Vivian kind of opened up with the history of it, and I'll just kind of shed some light on, or expand rather, on some of the points she made. And I think first and foremost, it's just funny to me that we have to argue, come up with reasons why education should be accessible to all people. Like the fact that it's still considered like a luxury when it's really a right is just insane in 2020. And for folks like us on the call who we do, like, you know, educating officials, elected officials, and creating all of these campaigns to fight for those who are being, you know, just prevented from having access to something that would empower them, no matter which way you want to look at it. It doesn't make sense to me in that sense. But, you know, literally, it does make sense when you look at the history of this country. And as Vivian pointed out, you know, Black people, enslaved Africans, people that were brought here and used for slavery, they were not granted access to education. And even the books that they were given, the Bible had pages and verses ripped out that spoke about slavery and kind of denounced it. They do not want us to be educated because they know the cliche, knowledge is power, is so much truth to that. And if they can withhold that from a person that is doing 10 years in prison, that's the last thing they want, is for them to become educated, get home, and then combat and take down the same system that oppressed them and so many other people. So again, it is sad when I say that. It's crazy. You know, it's really sad that we have to go through these things, coming up with facts. Every time they ask questions, they want to know the facts. And then when you give them the facts, it's still rejected. And then it's like a moral argument that comes into play. So again, it's sad that we have to go through this in 2020, but it's just really revealing and telling about the power dynamics when you talk about who's you know, putting legislation into play, and those of us who are on the ground trying to convince them to do what we believe is right and what is right.
Well, you know, Terrell, I think you've already started to speak to a question I was going to ask you, which is like, who defines knowledge and knowledge production? Well, and so I will segue to Cassandra. So why is education a critical part of our demand for truth and reconciliation at this time?
You know, so what I would say is that there are so many things to be said about how we look at issues. And I didn't laugh, but I felt it when Vivian was like, I was a part of the construction of the conversation around reentry and recidivism. And I think one of the things that's super important for us, as we do the work at Drug Policy Alliance, is really framing our work around how these policy decisions were not collateral. They're not by circumstance, but that they are actual intentional decisions. And so when we think about education, we know, like when we're looking at the overdose crisis and we're looking, why are the same communities being impacted? We're looking at education attainment. We're looking at unemployment. We're looking at housing stability, access to healthcare, and recognizing that this systematic divestment has created the circumstances for which we are dealing with the symptoms of a root cause problem, which is how do we take education and knowledge out of people's space, which destabilizes them and could lead to certain things as drug addiction. And that's important for us to recognize, because as we move and build our campaigns, it's not about telling people like, you should let us learn how to read. It's like, the government has corrupted the institution of education. It has overreached, it has overregulated our space and what we are able to access, and it is disrupting our ability to lead lives of dignity and autonomy. They don't want to give us choice, and so they curate what we have as options. And so when we have conversations about education, oftentimes people would think like, why is DPA in this conversation? And it's not that we are leading this conversation, it's that we see that education equity has a direct linkage to the way that they use the drug war to disrupt our families and destabilize our homes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You are drawing a red thread through what Terrell and Vivian brought forth. And one of the things that you pulled out that I thought was very powerful, you said that they curate what we have as options, and that's very true. And the impact of that is long reaching. Dominique, I want to throw this to you and ask you then, why does the Black community and formerly incarcerated communities sometimes reject education as a path forward for brothers and sisters upon release? Talk about, is education rooted in whiteness, and what are at stake with those patterns?
Absolutely. I would like to first offer just family as a term, because that creates positions for people who identify outside of the binary of brother or sister or male or female. And I think we struggle for a couple of reasons. One, capacity to create space to engage in. Here's what when I look at life, I'm like, if a white person is struggling, then with all the privileges they have, this must really be some stressful places, right? And so when I see my Black family who are going through PhD programs and all these other places that have never been inside of an institution, I would say they're system impacted, but they may not have been incarcerated. I always think, my God, how do we expect someone who can't get a job, someone who can't get housing, someone who doesn't have a credit score to get a car to get to the campus, someone who doesn't have the comprehensive sex education to be able to build relationships with a multitude of people, someone with the barriers around anxiety and fear to be on a campus full of people, to walk in there and have the space in themselves to engage in a program. And so I often say, like, I think that's an unfair ask, because we haven't removed the other barriers. We haven't created space in the spirit, in the minds, and the bodies of folks who have been oppressed by these systems to engage in education in the way that you deserve to. Because what I also have come to just understand, my own experience going through secondary education, is that you deserve to enjoy the experience. It shouldn't feel like going back to prison again. Oh, child, I got to go to this class. My beloved, you paying a whole lot of money for this. Like, why don't you have joy in this? And oftentimes when I'm talking to formerly incarcerated people who are taking these classes, because this is what I was supposed to do. This is the only way that I'm going to be successful. They tell me if 1 + 1 = 2, then I'm going to get over here. And so the second piece is that it's not really based in their desires. It feels like another oppressive system they have to trudge through to get some access of privilege. And it feels, and there's an air of resentment. The last thing is that many of these spaces, all of these spaces, are based in whiteness and feel anti to the ways that most of us show up. You will see folks with sororities and fraternities, some of the clubs, people who try to find space to come together and find community. But oftentimes we feel like we're just floating in these spaces. We feel like we are just on borrowed time when we deserve to be there as much as anyone else. And that's difficult to expect someone to open themselves up to the process of education in the way that many of these institutions engage in education, and feel like you're going to be taking on harm just because you want to learn. That you're going to add trauma to your trauma database simply because you need to get this degree, because if you're a 2-3 time felon, without a degree, you may not even get a job at McDonald's. And when I speak of McDonald's, it's like on the spectrum of, to be able to go in there and get what people would consider a entry-level opportunity, you need to have these things. So those are the big things that I see from not only just talking to folks who have not been incarcerated, but talking to the Black and Pink members. We have 23,000 people who send us thousands of pieces of mail a month, and those fears are expressed there.
Yes, Cassandra, please.
So one of the things I also wanted to offer is that this narrative that Black folks reject education and don't see it as a pathway forward is a narrative that was given to us. And I think it's really, really important for us to challenge and interrogate it every time it's given to us. I think that the word education has a formalized meaning to it, and it's really important for us to recognize that knowledge is not limited to the formalized institution of education. And so I say that because our folks that are selling drugs and dealing drugs, are entrepreneurs doing business, doing chemistry, doing marketing and packaging. And a lot of it, some of it is happening in formalized institutions. There are a lot of people selling drugs in Columbia University that are never getting caught and never getting criminalized or stigmatized. And then there are a lot of people down the block in Marcus Harvey housing development that are also doing the same thing, but we're not seeing that knowledge base the same. And so I want to offer that we are learning so many things, and that the thing that we're trying to offer is people the opportunity to learn and to build knowledge, and that can happen within the institutions of schools because that is how it's credentialized. But we should make sure that as we build the narratives and build the kind of work and the world that we want, that we recognize that the way that they've weaponized the narrative about our education and our attainment is of them, because we are rejecting the formalized education because our kids have to walk through metal detectors, because they have beyond zero tolerance policies that kick people out for schools because of drugs, or weapons because they don't feel safe, or and so I just want to really lift up the ways that that we're constantly reacting to those narratives, when part of it is that we have to create the new structure of how we engage.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Cassandra, because there's a body of literature and scholars who have been writing about decolonizing our thought processes and the whole idea of knowledge production that Terrell spoke to, that the knowledge of the community, the knowledge of the neighborhood, the knowledge of the block, the knowledge of the family, the knowledge that is generated in community is of the same importance as the knowledge production that's in the traditional white European male university. And we need to decolonize our thinking on that. And so I really appreciate the comments from everyone on this. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add before we move on and talk a little bit about abolition and conditions of confinement?
Just quickly, because Cassandra, first of all, you always bless me, but also just in this moment, I realized that the supremacy in these institutions are built to adapt. because we're watching them do it. A good friend of mine, Dr. Tunette Powell, don't let me take that from that sister, at UCLA made a post about a new protocol that went out to her kindergarten son's class, that parents should announce themselves before they come on Zoom. They can't just come and talk to teachers. They need to schedule an appointment before. And this idea of like, you're teaching my child in my home, and I don't have unlimited access to engage in the process, to support my child, to talk to you, to ask a question if that's the case. And I just was kind of sitting with that last night of this idea that it just moves. It will always morph. And so you're watching young people in real time divest from what they're being given because it feels anti to everything that speaks to them. So Cassandra, just thank you. But we are watching a new system of oppression, of supremacy unfold in front of us under the guise of this pandemic, when we all have been navigating a multitude of pandemics before this, and white people didn't care about that then.
Right. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Dominique. And so let me quickly remind everybody to drop your questions in the comment section for Q&A at the end. Vivian,
I just want to add a little, the thread I see running through this conversation about the control of the production of knowledge. Clearly access does not equal inclusion. And for inclusion to be real, then our knowledge base, the ways we produce knowledge, the oral tradition, the innovations in our communities, really ultimately in a equal society where there's equity, that would all be part of the canon, so that even formalized education would include our experience, right? And so people who fall in love with the idea of learning with academia, who want to be in that space, should be able to influence it in that way, so that we are represented in the canon, so that when people learn, they are also learning about our history and our contributions and our thought processes. And that's inclusion as opposed to just access.
Yes, thank you so much. And I mean, we have the amazing African-American women scholars and men scholars of the African and African-American diaspora, and that whole scholarship line of writers who have led the charge on that starting from the 70s on. And we're very grateful for their knowledge. But I know that there is much more that is coming out of the lived experience of incarceration that also needs to move to the forefront. That experience of confinement offers a particular lens, a particular insight that have often, that of late has not been captured in the way in which it should. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate this conversation. So let's talk a little bit about abolition and improving the conditions of confinement. Terrell, is there an either or in abolition versus reforms?
I do not believe that there is an either or in this space, especially given like the times that we are in, the way this machine is well oiled and has been in place again since Reconstruction, right? Which we literally have been in reform mode this entire time. Slavery has not been abolished. It is, by the 13th Amendment, it is still legal if you are convicted of a crime in this country. So as a former slave myself, I understand that that institution has not been done away with, is still in place. And therefore, I move in the way that I'm going to continue to reform with my allies, colleagues, those who are like-minded, continue to reform until it's gone. And I think when it comes to allyship, as we mentioned, earlier, right? I think allies and advocates have to step into this space realizing that you are a supporter of someone else's movement, and therefore it is not up to you to dictate that particular group's living condition. If you're talking about conditions of confinement, right? In Alabama, for years, and Utah, they've been talking about getting rid of these like old, decrepit, dilapidated prisons. And I've been to Alabama. I've been to at least 5 prisons in Alabama, and I've seen these places, right? I would not want to be incarcerated, number one, anywhere, but damn sure not in Alabama. And for advocates to think they're doing the right thing and saying like, we shouldn't be using super prisons. That's what they want to call them. We shouldn't be using super prisons, right? And they might cite, certain facts and statistics that, again, is written by maybe like a white liberal think tank or something like that. They want to use those facts and stats to support why it's not okay to move forward with this movement, right? If there is, state of the art, and I don't want to say state of the art, but updated facilities, right? Conditions that are way better than what the men that I've met with are living in. They have rats crawling across them at night, sewage coming up in Mississippi, another state, sewage coming up out of the pipes. Like, and for us to be on the outside and try to cite information and stop movements like that, while I understand it's not the best, solution by far. I would not support, normally I would not support building a new prison, but at the same time, as a privileged person that is out here, I'm like, man, I don't have rats crawling across me at night, snatching my food. I don't have water dripping on my face at night. And therefore, I understand that as a privileged person out here, I need to listen to the voices on the inside, listen to those men and women and hear what they're thinking, because they're not included in any of those discussions that the people in power are having, or even amongst ourselves out here as we're coming up with reasons to combat, certain movements like that. But again, on the higher education piece, I don't believe that supporting higher education in prison, whether it's through Pell grants or just programs, period, I don't believe in that notion or ideology that is in some way, shape, or form supporting the idea of being okay with prisons existing. It's like, until they're gone, right, we need to make sure that people inside are getting the services that they need, that they're getting the education that they can use and need when they come home. We need to make sure that's in place until we could do away with the system, right? So that's how I approach it. That argument of either or is just flawed in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Terrell. I appreciate what you said so much, because you're right. We have to provide for people's quality of life right now. Dominique, why do abolitionists often come from a place of privilege?
To really sit in a space where you can divest from every system, there has to be an inherent amount of privilege for that to happen. And I'm talking about the spectrum of systems, because people talk about abolition around, defund the police, jails, and prisons. Like, people can agree on that, but it's like, well, I don't shop at Walmart because they pay their people this much an hour. Well, sis, I get $80 of food stamps a month. I got to shop at Walmart because that's closest to me, and I know exactly how much I can get with that $80. I'm not going to drive this type of car because it's negative to the community. Well, I can only pay for this type of car. This is the only way I can get around, and this is what I have to do. And so, to be able to sit in spaces of abolition, the real mainstream version of abolition that's perpetuated in many communities, and often by white people, it takes a lot of privilege to be able to have those conversations. Many of them don't know what they would do if they had to call the police, because they've never been in that circumstance. Many of them can say, well, someone took my thing, I'll just replace it, because they have access to those funds to be able to do that. If I have I have 5 cases of water in my living room. If someone went and picked up a case of water, I wouldn't be so pressed because I had 4 more cases. If that was my last bottle of water that was taken, it would hit a little different, right? Access privilege changes that. But there is this space of, I think, a black and white perspective on anything that's based on people. And I believe the spirit and the desire to abolish these systems of harm are inherently about people, because that's who these systems are harming. How can it be one way or another?
Right.
There needs to be so much yes and that's not. I think I am in a space where I really am divesting and really addressing my epistemology around words that I've carried for the last 38 years.
Mm.
Compromises this negative context. Because I know so many people who think that they're standing straight up, but they've leaned and bent so much they can't even look at you in their face. That's compromise to me, beloved. Compromise is not the fact that I want these institutions gone. And as my brother Terrell said, I also, if anybody in there wants to learn, if somebody who's 50 years old with the reading level of the third grade who catches a prison case and they expect you to know everything about that case wants to learn how to read, who am I to say, you know what, that's not abolitionist. That's not really how we get to our vision. The last thing I will say is that the idea for Black folks is that we've been indoctrinated that these systems are for us. We also have this inherent idea that life is fair. And so we think these systems will treat other people the way that they treat us. And one of the big barriers around divestment and a space of privilege that many Black people don't get to sit in is that white people have somewhat of a definition of justice because it happens for them swiftly. Retribution, revenge, ownership, power is how they've maintained their hold. For many Black folks, some of us are in our first generation of understanding what power and privilege and hold looks like. So how do we, as an entire community, walk into abolitionist values in this easy way that people think we should, when we don't even really believe the world cares about us? And so, and I think it takes a bit of privilege to think that you can be loved. And abolition is about love and community to me. So yeah, permeates everywhere. And when you partner privilege with whiteness and a mainstream approach and a desire for something to be prepackaged and handed on the cover of Time magazine, beloved, it's always gonna go astray.
Mm. 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 Absolutely. Thank you, Dominique. You give me life. And I appreciate everything that you said. Cassandra, can you talk about how this is playing out, what Dominique and Terrell talked about? How is this playing out in the drug space?
I think the thing that I would offer is that changing people's material conditions inside is not reform. It is in the tradition of abolition. If we are trying to invest in our community, build community, and give people the conditions so that they may thrive, I think I think those conversations are reductive if we don't think that that is important. And I say that because in the drug space, oftentimes when we are pushing for things like providing medication treatment inside jails and prisons, folks will say, I thought you wanted to end the drug war. Why? And you don't think people should be incarcerated. So why are you investing in the jails and prisons? And what I will say is that the overdose crisis, if it's happening outside, then you know it's happening inside. And the hard thing about it is that we don't have the data. So many people are dying of overdose in jails and prisons, and they refuse to count all the deaths in that way because there's not supposed to be drugs inside. But we know there are drugs inside, right? And we know who's bringing the drugs. Excuse me. We know who's bringing the drugs. We know like how that is proliferating. And so for us, it's imperative. We can't end the drug war and free all our people if they're all dead from overdose from being inside, because you're telling us that fighting for medication inside jails and prisons is not ending the drug war, right? And that it is investing in institutions, right? And to me, I'm like, people can't be free if they're dead. Like, that's just not happening. And so that there is a conversation here about what it is, what that this false choice, when we create this false choice, we harm the people we say we are trying to work with. We harm the people that we say we're trying to do the work for, right? But this is what is really crucial. And Vivian, I'm Reverend Nixon. You know this very well. Is that not all reforms are worthy reforms? And I think that is the difference where people conflate. The word reform is used for so many harmful things. that it gets really difficult to pull out the things that are necessary in order for us to abolish the conditions on which we are fighting. And so Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who is one of the leading abolitionists, right? Because I get a little nervous when we talk about abolition and privilege, because there's so many Black women who have created the canon around abolition that is being perverted by people who have privilege, right? And so oftentimes when I find the conversation around reform and abolition, I'm often like, okay, cool. What are you doing for the people that are inside right now? Are you also doing that work as you work to tear stuff down? Because both things are important. But what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says is that, the conversation about reform or abolition, like that question is like, is it that useful? The question is, are you abolishing the conditions that are setting up the thing that you are fighting? If we know education attainment is crucial to stabilizing people's lives and giving people access so that they might not commit harm towards others, why are we creating more roadblocks or convincing ourselves that working to give people education is not something that would abolish the conditions for people to be there in the first place, right? If we are not working if I want to end the overdose crisis, but ignore the overdose crisis that is happening in jails and prisons, then I'm actually not working on the overdose crisis, right? Because we know, especially, that people are coming in and out of jails because of drug use. And if they die on the outside or they die on the inside, both those things matters to me. And so that is why I try to not deal with this conversation, because what's clear to me is that our mandate for Drug Policy Alliance is we want to end the drug war. Our tagline is no more drug war. Not drug war, no more drug war out here and drug war in jails and prisons. It's no more. That means everywhere. So we are trying to abolish all the conditions that set up the condition of the drug war. And that is why when we have conversations about reform and abolition, if you're telling me we don't want to arrest people for drugs, but we want to force them into treatment, that is not a reform I can support, because it is doing the same exact thing. And so it's really about understanding, what is the reform? Is it for the material wellness of the individual, or is it prison by another name, criminalization by a different actor, stigma by a different tagline? Those are the things that we want to figure out. Is it policing by a different institution? If I am working to erode and abolish those conditions, that is the work. You can call it reform, but I know that I have the clear goal of changing the material conditions of people. And if it does that without prioritizing, reinforcing, and building out structures that will continue to do harm, that is a different conversation. But we have to do the balance. But I think some people are distracted in this moment, and they're distracted and they're destructive. And our people that are inside and coming in and out, and in institutions that confine you, so like immigration detention centers, child welfare systems, psychiatric hospitals, jails and prisons, all these different places, they're struggling and they're dying because we're out here playing with theoretical purity.
Thank you so much. We are out here playing with theoretical
purity. I'm going to remember that.
Thank you so much. So, Vivian, can you argue for higher education inside while still ultimately pursuing decarceration?
I mean, the question even just irritates me. Like, I know you're the moderator, you're supposed to ask questions. But again, it's already been said. And thank you, Cassandra, for bringing Ruthie's, invoking her name into the conversation, because, I mean, she really gets it and frames things in a way that people can ingest and live and breathe and do their work without feeling that they're somehow betraying some bigger, more moral goal, right? But education itself is a process that is about material development, the health, the well-being of a person, no matter how that education is attained, right? And we've talked about the multiple ways of knowledge production. Education itself is what keeps a person from being stuck in a place of pain or harm or unproductivity, right? You learn something different, and then you ultimately, Maya Angelou says, once you really know, your behavior changes. Like if you're not doing something different, then you don't really know yet. You're still in the learning process. So education is fundamental to a progressive life, a life that is moving and flowing and changing and growing. And in this argument about education, whether it's inside prison or outside of prison, with the population of folks who have been harmed and continue to be harmed by systems of our criminal legal system, it, it I wonder sometimes if it's meant to reduce the power of people to actually own the movement. Because Terrell mentioned earlier, we use the phrase, but it's not just a phrase. There's research, there's a lifetime of evidence that knowledge is power. That the people who transformed our conditions the most, that first generation after Reconstruction, because they got some knowledge, had some power, built some sustainable communities that people decided to destroy, right? When we look at the Black Panther movement, many of those people were highly educated, self-educated inside of prisons. When they started to gain some power, though, they had to be destroyed. So I'm wondering if this denial of an access to power is about, well, if you learn too much, if you know too much, then you're going to be in charge of this movement.
It's a worthy question. It's a worthy question. Absolutely. Does anyone else have any other thoughts they would like to add to this? I think that you guys have mic dropped this whole entire section, and this is. Go ahead.
What Ms. Vivian said about knowledge and the intentional prevention of it, I without a doubt know that's real. And I said this to my therapist the other day, that I am really grateful that I don't know everything I know now when I was in prison. I believe I survived in there because I didn't know any better. Because I didn't know they were abusing me. I didn't know that they were treating me differently. They were treating other people. I didn't know that my 8 to 16 year sentence for stealing cars and writing checks compared to manslaughter charges for white kids for 5 to 10 years was based on just my skin color. I didn't know that the 18 months in solitary confinement under the Prison Rape Elimination Act was simply because I was a queer person. I didn't know. And so because I didn't know, they were able to hurt me, but I also was able to kind of duck my head in the sand. And now that I know, I don't know if I would have even survived it. They would have probably had to kill me. And they kill folks every day who know better. And so the way that we are affirming this spectrum of knowledge, of saying that all knowledge is valid from your grandmother's knee to a PhD program, these brothers are well educated and they know. And those are the first brothers that you're going to find in segregation. Yep. If those are the first brothers you look at their misconduct report history, you're going to see it. Those are the women that they intentionally hold visitation with their children over them to keep them quiet. I see it. The ones who know are the ones that they keep their neck on. The ones, and I was one of those ones who thought, you know what? This is just what we deserve and we just got to do better. We're the ones that they exalt and we lift up. And I say that standing in the fact that as much as I engage in anti-Blackness, I engage in this, I perpetuated many of the policies of the system, including believing that it was my fault for many of the things that happened to me. So very much so, there is intentional defense around us accessing knowledge. Because if we get it, we're going to weaponize it. And because of the way that Black folks are, because of how community happens, we will then dole it out to other people. And then there will be a critical mass. And then you will see things like Donald Trump be able to exist.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And I thank you so much. I'm thinking about the reality that in my own incarceration, women who had the ability to organize other women were the women who were shipped every 2 years from the 3 facilities, just shipped around. And there's an actual technical term for that. It's called bus therapy. So that you are always living in a disrupted state. Your visitation with your family, your children is always disrupted. Your inmate trust fund monies is always disrupted because you are constantly being uprooted. And I always found that amongst the most educated, woke, progressive, and community-minded women in the facility. And in my state, the majority of the women in the prison was white, and the minority was Black. And so it was a weird situation to watch white women lose their privilege to a certain degree and be treated like Black people and Black women by being tossed and thrown from facility to facility to facility because they would work with us. They would communicate. They would be in community with us. It's just interesting the way in which race kind of shifts inside sometimes in some locations. And I think this whole idea of this bus therapy and punishing people for seeking access and for sharing knowledge, I mean, that's absolutely the root of what we're talking about today, and why we have coalitions of people organized today trying to make sure that education becomes a right in these institutions. I think it's right. I think it speaks right into the next thing that we need to talk about, which is centering those who are directly impacted. When we're talking about allyship and those people, as Terrell and the rest of this panel brought forth, and let's throw this to you, Dominique, because you opened the floor. How should allies show up in spaces where directly impacted people lead?
We tell you we need you to show up. And don't I think I would say probably many of us knows that if you wake up on Saturday morning when you were younger and there was a right playlist playing, you knew that you had to go clean something or there was going to be some smoke in the place where you were living at. You didn't do that willingly, you did it. Now, after it was done, you wanted to be celebrated. I know myself, I was like, well, honey, I need $10, $15 to go up here to the mall or whatever. So I did something that I didn't really want to do. Then I wanted you to reward me for it. But I lived in the house. And I think back to why my mom was so mad. She's like, well, you sit your butt on that toilet, you would want to wipe the toilet, right? So many allies come into spaces. When they're asked to do something, they do it begrudgingly. They want to be rewarded and given a t-shirt that says they're an ally. And then they want a celebration. When you're improving the same communities you live in, many of you all move into these communities because you want to be a part of creating change. That's what humanity is about. That's why we are here, to engage with each other, to create circumstances that are better, right? And so really be open and be joyful about listening to and being led by the folks that you want to serve. Come with a spirit of servant leadership. And many people cannot do that because they also approach allyship based in saviorship. It's rooted in this idea that I'm better than you. I need to fix this for you. You don't have the answers. Poor, you've been struggling. No, we have the answers. We've been making it. The issue is that no one is listening to our answers. We tell you that we want to strive. We want to make sure that our people have access to treatment, and our people from institutions can get rides to visit their families and things of that nature. And y'all build us a park. Well, sis, how we gonna get to the park? Right? It's like you jump over those things. And so a spirit of servant leadership in solidarity without the expectation of reward and without the idea that you're an ally. It's the allyship. And I love, it's a lot of white folks that say it. So sometimes I'll be like, Dominique, do you want to add this to your tool belt? But I'll acquiesce today. This conversation of being a co-conspirator feels just grimy enough for me. You know what I'm saying? To where you really about some work. You know that scene and Set It Off when they in the car and they like, yo, we about to do this. You know, TT wasn't about it, but TT went nonetheless, huh? And so I want you in it with me. And in time, I'm gonna look over at you and be like, you know what? You really here. And I've never used the language of somebody who is engaging in work that may better my life more than theirs. And I've looked over and said, that's an ally. I'd be like, that's my fam. That's my people. Are they cool? So on and so forth. So that's really important about why you engage and how you engage, and be prepared to be led.
Cassandra, as an ally of formerly incarcerated people, do you ever struggle with any of this?
I'm just gonna pause here. Dr. Dixon, you look like you wanted to jump in there.
Save it, because it's like it's so in me. It won't go away. It'll be there when you're done.
Okay.
I want to get you in there.
So no, so I 1,000% agree with Dominique. I think the only thing that I would offer is that Miriam Kaba says that just because, and Andrea James, who runs the National Council, also says just because you have an experience doesn't mean you should lead. And I think that is also a conversation about who we follow, because there are a lot of people with experiences that are not working towards the same thing, right? Because they haven't done the work that Dominique has done, where she sees like, oh, I'm also perpetuating the things around structure. And so I'm very like, I think the thing that is important for people that work with other people is having integrity about who you follow. And also it's thinking for yourself, but not thinking for others. And I think that there's a difference there, because I need to have a spirit of discernment about who I'm following. And it can't just be because someone is formerly incarcerated. It's because that person is formerly incarcerated and has a political analysis to where I'm trying to go. And I think that the thing that gets really scary sometimes is, as we have said, that the system adjusts. And so then you will have a bunch of people following someone who's very problematic. And then they're doing things to disrupt the work that we're doing and saying, well, you're not following formerly incarcerated people. And it's like, well, I don't want to follow that one, because this person ain't about nothing and is really trying to like do, so it's like, it's also about like, people gotta have, it is a collaboration, right? Yeah. And it's around power and sharing and understanding, because it's just the same thing where people think all Black people are the key of understanding racism. I'm not trying to follow some of these Black folks that are out here saying all kinds of ridiculous things, right? You got to find which Black person can you follow that is about something. And I think that as we navigate this conversation around censoring directly impacted people, I think it's the same thing. Like, how do we follow people with integrity? How do we ask questions and also recognize that the system is adjusting, because they have their own formerly incarcerated people that are doing all kinds of mess that are disorganizing and disrupting and destabilizing our movement currently. And so I think as an ally, it's about building a sense of understanding and integrity. And building a political analysis, because it can get confusing. So my question is, no, I don't have a problem with it, but I do think it will take more for me to follow than someone only having an experience. The person has to be like, I want to know who your people are. That is the question you ask people to find out who you follow. Who are your people? What have they done? Who follows you? Is it just you by yourself on a Twitter page tweeting stuff all together? Or are you connected to people? If you out of line, can someone hold you and say, you acting out? That is how I know if I'm following you.
I think that's spot on, Cassandra. I took a couple courses with Professor Ruth Gilmore, and one thing she told me is that she said, geography doesn't equal consciousness. And if you think about that, just because you have an experience in a particular location doesn't mean that you have an abolition consciousness, right? And so I think that's a major takeaway that you offered, and I appreciate it so much. So, Ms. Vivian, let me give you the floor. And when you bring forth your comments, can you also speak to what kind of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated inclusion is actually exploitative?
Yeah. So great. This is good. So Cassandra really led right into where I was coming, because I made a commitment in 2020 to, the conversations I have with my friends who are doing this work, those conversations that happen at midnight and on weekends where it's just la, 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 la. It's time to be public with all of that. And it's not just what the people, centering it in people who share some integrity and some values and are grounded in some history. It's also, what does centering look like? So if I'm running an organization and the organization is growing and my responsibilities are becoming a weight on me, but I'm sending people to represent me into spaces where changes are being made, and those people may not look like me and may not have the same experience, but they work in the organization I run. Does that not qualify as centering my leadership? Why I got to show up everywhere? Like I'm one person. I mean, this is real. And this is how people get burnt out. It's how some of my team might get disrespected because they don't have the credential of having had a number for a name at one time. Like, that's ridiculous. We need to stop that, because when it's the other organizations and their CEO or president doesn't show up, you don't ask why. You just accept that. What's the second part? What does the anti-integrity look like?
Yeah.
Well, I think each person has to develop their own value system and make that decision. But for me, it looks like any other thing that is being proliferated in culture that denigrates, demeans, undervalues our commitment to lifting up our people in ways that contribute to our progress rather than either keep us stagnant or set us back. So, the best way to say that is, please be grounded in some history. Please remember how we got this far, and that the people who struggled in my parents' generation and my grandparents and my great-great-grandparents weren't weak or ineffective. They had to deal with so much more than you can ever imagine. And the fact that we're still alive is a miracle, and respect that, right? And move that into your picture of what the future looks like, and embrace the fact that the future success may not look like it's being portrayed in today's popular culture, that there's some history to identifying what success looks like. And it may not necessarily look like, oh, now I can wear Gucci.
So what do you think is the main, and we can have this as a general discussion, Vivian, I just want to pull off of what you're talking about. What do you think then is the next steps that need to happen to unravel that, like, to actively stop that? Like, what do you see on the horizon for those allies who are wanting to enter this work? What do they need to be doing that they're not currently doing?
Again, every person has their own way of making progress. For me, I spent the first 5 years just learning, just watching, listening, and learning. And anytime I found what I was doing was ineffective, I tried to figure out why, and I made adjustments. And I know that there are more adjustments to come. And I ground myself in learning by watching others, by recognizing when something is ineffective, and then making that slow, move to change it, which is it's not only a slow process, it's a painful process, because it involves some self-adjustment. Self-adjustment is not easy.
Right.
But be willing. You got to have somebody that you're willing to share your shortcomings with, and that you're willing to get feedback from. If it's just one person, But if nobody's ever given you any negative feedback ever, that's a red flag.
I love that. I appreciate that. So we are closing out, but I do want to get one more question out. Also, for those of you who are watching, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A chat at the so that we can get back to those questions. Cassandra, do we always know when people are formerly incarcerated? For some, this is not their primary identity. Can you give us some examples of that?
I think that people often silo folks. So I think folks are like, formerly incarcerated leadership is in the criminal justice space, but miss that there are formerly incarcerated people doing work in the housing space, obviously doing work in education, doing work in repro justice. In the movement space that I'm in for drug policy, a lot of the leadership is formerly incarcerated because we have drug user unions. So you have people whose primary identity, or the identity that is foreground, is that of their relationship to drugs. But these are a lot of the same people that are in and out of incarceration, and that have histories of confinement, either in detention centers or through child welfare. And so, I think one of the things that is important is normalizing and mainstreaming the fact that formerly incarcerated leadership is throughout the social justice space. And that while it might not be people's primary identity that they lead with in their work, because they might be in a different space. So in the drug space, people's identity as being someone who has a relationship to drugs is the identity that gives them the most cachet to build their platform. That they are formerly incarcerated leadership, and that it's important for us as we build our collaborative agenda forward to see the opportunities to platform and elevate formerly incarcerated leadership, even if it's not the primary thing that they push forward. Because so much of our work around harm reduction and drug policy is informed by, if not led by, folks with incarceration history. So I think about a lot of the work that I've done with groups like Vocal New York. So many of their leadership have incarceration histories. In fact, right now they're running a campaign in New York telling formerly incarcerated people that they can vote. And they're like highlighting their members who everyone knows in their advocacy around drugs, who are saying like, I'm formerly incarcerated and I plan to vote. Like, these are things that they're doing. But to me, it was interesting because we had this conversation before where I was just like, yeah, like our movement is led by formerly incarcerated people in so many different ways. But people often forget. And I think, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that formerly incarcerated people are everywhere, right? And they're doing so many different things, and that their contributions to society are not just in the silos that people project them to be in, that formerly incarcerated people are using their incarceration histories to not only inform the kind of political analysis that we need to move forward, but also to make sure that it is as robust as possible. And so I think the thing is to just to not be ignorant to that people are everywhere in multiple different places, and they should be.
Well, they're even that on this call, right? All of you are involved as advocates and formerly incarcerated people in multiple levels. You're not all in the same field doing the same work. So we have to offer final comments from the panelists at this time. And while you do, I want to just kind of add to your final thoughts, to think about how education builds power, and why this work is critical at this time, in this particular moment that we're in. And Terrell, we'll start with you. Let's offer your final comments and
Thank you. Yeah, I've been, so many great points were made. I think my final thoughts would be, one, on the piece of like, or the conversation of like exploitation. I think I think in the way our quote unquote allies exploit the same groups that they claim to fight for. And it comes out in a number of ways. One of them is using people as poster children, rather. I was used as a poster child once upon a time, being put on the pedestal and saying like, look, this is the great work that we're, getting done here. Or, as Cassandra mentioned, folks just kind of like not listening, not only not listening to the group, but again, trying to dictate what is best for them. And I shouldn't have to lead with me being formally incarcerated, especially if it has nothing to do with the conversation. And in my previous work, when working for, a justice organization in New York, I would meet people from different states. And when they would finally hear me say that I was formally incarcerated, because I trusted the incarcerated group of students that I was talking to, because no matter who's around, when I get in front of people that I will probably never see again in my life, at least that's what my thinking was, like, I may never come to Oklahoma again. I need to tell this group of students where I came from and how I got to where I am now, and that it's possible. Not the bootstrap mentality, like, oh, well, I did it, you could do it too. It's like, yo, bro, I struggled to get here, but it's possible. The fact that I'm sitting before you right now after having a violent crime, like, it's possible. And then the person, a part of the college program, sometimes a part of the corrections institution, they'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't know you were, formally incarcerated. And I'm like, I didn't know it mattered. Like, why did I have to tell you that? I shouldn't have to, shake hands with you and say, hello, my name's Terrell. I've been in prison before. So, like, again, Cassandra was saying, it's about the agency and giving me ownership and autonomy over when I get to share that. And a lot of allies do not do that. The second thing I wanted to say, and it was like double Dutch. I was trying to get in there earlier so I could jump in and say this, but there's an idea that justice is up for negotiation, especially on the topic of Pell grants for people in prison. I'm not here to negotiate justice with nobody's senator, congressman, congresswoman. Like, the conversations that are happening, especially around the whole reason this movement, Equity is Justice, is here is because people are talking about leaving out a certain group of folks, those who are serving life without prison, out of the conversation of Pell grants. And there's a lot of people, individuals, organizations that are okay with that. And that doesn't sit right with me. I'm not here to talk to, some folks and say like, well, at the end of the day, if you don't want to do, those who are serving life without prison, I'm good with that. It's like, no, that doesn't sit right with me. So I think, again, that speaks to the privilege that advocates and allies have, where you're out here fighting for people in prison, but you're so willing to exclude a group of people in there. And it's like, why? And it's divisive. They divide us based on conviction types. That spills out into this work where, people who are convicted of sex offenses, they want to sometimes shy away from them, or politicians might use, those dog whistle politics and talk about, we're putting together this project, but it's only for low-level drug offenders. And it's like, wait a second, you leaving out a whole group of people that, for the most part, is people that look like me, that have violent offenses, right? So why are we only going for low-level drug crimes? So I really wanted to hit on that piece. For folks who think they're really about the movement, justice is not up for negotiation. If you're going to restore Pell, it's going to be for everybody in prison. It's not going to boil down to who's serving what and what length of the sentence. It's going to be for everybody who wants a shot at education.
Thank you so much, Terrell, for saying that. You're dead right. Justice is not up for negotiation. So I'm gonna get final comments from Cassandra and Vivian and Dominique, and then we have questions in the queue already. Cassandra.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I was like, oh, that's me. So what, the only thing that I would say is I think it's so incredible that this conversation was framed in the way that it was, because I think so much of the conversation is framed as a
Yeah.
negotiation, to Terrell's point. And so I'm very grateful for uh, the shift that Equity is Justice has done to really just say, like, this is actually not something we're supposed to be negotiating around. This is necessary, and people deserve it. And that it is important for people's dignity and autonomy. And Terrell, to your point, especially, as being a part of the movement that really propelled the narrative of the nonviolent drug offender, I just want to acknowledge that and say that we're sorry, and that we know how damaging and hard and how much that created the table of negotiation. It's what we did because it was politically viable. But that if we want to be in true communication and collaboration towards a greater vision of justice, that, if we're going to talk about drugs, then let's talk about drugs. But we can't close the door behind us for other people. And so I just want to say that.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. Vivian.
So yeah, I'm really grateful for this panel, for the way you brought your whole selves to the conversation and your experiences and the truth of how those of us who live this work on another level experience the work. So I want to thank y'all for that, and I want to take this quick opportunity just thank the team at Equity is Justice, who's the brilliance behind the campaign, and everybody out there doing this work. We don't all do it in the same way, and because someone does the work differently than me, I don't negate whatever contributions they're making, but I do hope and pray for the day when we find enough of a connection, because of all the pieces of the puzzle to come together as one, so that we can actually envision what we say we want, which is a future that's free from systems of harm and punishment. We have the power to do it, but not as long as we're scattered. So that's my closing thought: is let this be the beginning of a coming together of really seeing how each piece is connected to the other. And we have in our history, we have examples, we have proof that we are capable.
Mm-hmm.
We are not waiting to be rescued. We are capable within ourselves as people of color, as people who have been harmed, as people under oppression. We have proven it is possible to overcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Dominique, would you like to offer your final thoughts before we go into the Q&A?
I want to say that I definitely completely agree with Terrell about this idea of, again, it takes a lot of privilege to be able to lead with your being formerly incarcerated. And I have gotten to cringe when I'm around folks and you're in a room, you're like, oh, well, where are you locked up at? And it's very akin to like, what hood you from, what school you go to, so on and so forth. Sis, don't worry about what yard I walked. No, I walked it, right? So that's one piece. And that really pushed me to really lean into system impacted, because around the No New Jails time, I was watching people in real time say, well, you only incarcerated in states. I did Fed time, so my voice matters as a formerly incarcerated leader. Yours doesn't. System impacted, I think, really uplifts and carries us into this journey of abolitionists, like an abolitionist community, because it says we're all system impacted to different degrees, but system impacted allows me to talk to the person in the prison, talk about their child, talk about their partner, talk about the neighborhood store that is no longer getting their money every week because they invested in those people, talk about the church that's missing their ties, and talk about their mother or father or whatever. We can have a holistic conversation of the harm and impact of incarceration. So I would offer that, like removing formerly incarcerated as like a staple, and looking at system impacted. I also feel like that positions me for that to be a part of my story, like forever, and be all of my story. It's like calling myself an ex-con or ex-felon. If I got to add X in front of it for it to be erased, like my ex-husband, I really don't want that type of stress, right? And then this idea of with system impacted people, I think it's important for us to undo this idea that our story and our trauma history are all we have to offer in these spaces. Stop funding trauma porn. Stop liking posts that are based in trauma porn. Stop. If you have to cry for you to donate to my organization, I want you to find a safe space and engage in self-care before you go on to Act Blue, because you need to do some self-work. And that's not shade, that's just real. Your hurt, your pain should not have to be activated, or mine shouldn't have to be displayed for you to care about our mission and values. And the last thing I'll say is, because I'm like words and things, y'all should stop calling this second chance Pell, or this idea that chances have a number to them. Like opportunity, transformation, that's what I hear people talk about. Because in Nebraska, there's only one city that has the second chance Pell, and that's here in Omaha. At Metro Community College at the Fort Omaha campus, there's an entire building dedicated for system impacted people to get into this program. And I hear opportunity, I hear success, I hear joy, I hear transformation. And we have to stop saying that there is a number of times that you get chances. We have to stop saying that that once you pull so many of your straws are out, because I have never heard anybody who doesn't look like me be given a number of times that you can try to be your best self.
Wow. Thank you. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Can we
you.
stop funding trauma porn? Justice is not up for negotiation. Shared values should be grounded. We have to find our shared values, and they need to be grounded in history. Without the stop using the idea of allyship, but think about being a co-conspirator. Come with the spirit of servant leadership. Stop arguing for theoretical purity. All reforms are not worthy reforms. If people are dying on the inside and you're only concerned about the outside, then you're not doing reform. Compromise is a negative context. Allies and advocates must remember they are supporters of someone else's movement. Access does not equal inclusion. You need to add trauma. You need to remove trauma from your trauma database. Barriers and fears are oppressive. What does it say? Barriers and fear are tools of the system. We have the capacity to create space, and we need to do that. And we need to be mindful that they curate what we have as options. And we need to be thinking in terms of family, in terms of opportunity. Wow. Powerful panel, powerful voices coming forward today. I really thank each and every one of you for your contribution. Things are already popping in the chat for conversation. And let's start with the Q&A for Terrell. This question is from Hannah Queen. She says, hello, I am a political science major at Howard and an intern at Congresswoman Tran's office. Because Black, Indigenous people of color are system impacted without being formally incarcerated, where do we start to combat this lack of equity? What would provide tangible results for the community the fastest? Sure.
So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. While we're trying to decarcerate, we should also be trying to stop, the prison to school, the school to prison pipeline. It's so many different, it's such a tangled web that white supremacy has created. Like questions like that, I'm pretty sure came from a genuine place, but it's not one thing that we should be going after. It needs to happen on the front end as well as the back end. The pathways that we try to create, people like myself we try to create for those coming home, there is no re-entry without entry. So we need to stop that in the first place. And then it just trickles on down to, lack of access and quality education in neighborhoods where there's, low income or people of color, like whatever that looks like. It's just so many different things. I try to defer on this question because the answer is so convoluted and like I said, widespread. But that's the best I can give on that one.
Respond to it.
White men, I'll tell you.
What did you say something, Dominique? What was the question again? Okay, you're muted. Oh, there you go. I can hear you now. The question is, because Black, Indigenous people of color system impacted, even without being formally incarcerated, where do we start to combat this lack of equity? What would provide tangible results for the community the fastest?
If white people really handled their stuff and didn't handle it in silos or waiting for Thanksgiving dinner to happen for you to be a revolutionary. I mean, really look at not only how active harm is happening, but how you've benefited up from the harm of others. I think it's a poor approach to think that we can just look at what we are navigating now and not understand that like we all have inherited trauma and there's so much that we're navigating and it's not plug and play. And so I want to say that I think, and I don't know the race of the person who asked this, so I will also say this is that a benefit and one of the best things that abolition brought to me is that white people won't always have power over me, is that I can take it back. But as Black folks to have the sort of communities we want to have, because there are neighborhoods all over this country that are abolitionist streets, where you go on them streets and them blocks, when there's conflict, they handle it there. Everybody makes sure everybody eats, everybody checks on people, so on. If those things exist, I would say that as Black folks, Indigenous folks who are oppressed, we need to really engage in the work of purifying our bodies from white supremacy and really charging ourselves with engaging in love. And that doesn't mean you always engage in like. There's a lot of folks that I can't stand, but they still my people, right? And I think that's important because one, it brings us together, but two, white people show us that every day. There are white people right now at the top of our society who can't stand each other, but they will never tell us that. Why? Because them engaging in that solidarity maintains their power and access. So yes, addressing white supremacy and those behaviors, but I really want us to do a better job of dismantling these ideas that the intersectionality of our Blackness is something that should dead the desire for us to be in family to each other. Queerness, as a trans Black woman, the respect, the reverence I have for cisgender Black women is, I can't even explain it without crying, right? That community matters to me. Black men who are in my life, who love me and support me and who are there for me, are essential to my existence. At the same time, those are some of the same people who are murdering my sisters on a daily basis. And I sit in the yes and all the time, and I refuse to let my valid fears prevent me from community. Black folks and brown folks and Indigenous folks, our fears are valid, our hurt is valid. The way people have let us down is very valid, but please don't let that be used as a reason to keep you from your people, because that is another tool that they use to keep us in this space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, you all. We have one other question in the chat. This is from Diana Saint, and it says, pretrial men and women are being treated as slaves under the 13th Amendment too. How do we address the treatment of those who are not convicted as we continue to fight for the humanity of the convicted? And that's what we want.
Get rid of cash bail. That's it. I mean, that ain't, sister, ain't complicated.
Get rid of cash bail, and there really is no distinction. If putting somebody in a cage is putting somebody in a cage, pre-trial, post-trial, during trial, right? So, yeah, that's just, cash bail is the beast that drives that engine, and that has to be dispensed with.
Cash bail, probation, and drug court. Because there's people that are serving like 10 years on probation in the slightest slip up, and you'll still find your way into like incarceration. So yeah, everything.
Abolish drug courts. The one thing I would just say is that the way that you, Diana, the way that you're saying that, this is the thing that we have to interrogate. We shouldn't say that there's okay conditions because you're pre-conviction versus you being someone who has been convicted. And to Dr. Reverend Nixon's point, like that right there is what we have to say. We have to say no one should be enslaved in
No,
2020.
no,
Period.
no.
That's how we build the campaign. Because once we create making those arbitrary lines, they will exploit them.
Yes,
Yep.
absolutely.
And can I just address the senator's aide who asked the question, because and this would not be a handout. This is a debt owed. We cannot be afraid to have a conversation about reparations. That means really figuring out how do you make an investment in our communities that's as big as the contributions we made over 400 years.
Right.
And I think I think you have to see us thriving as an investment to your community for it to matter. Because
Right.
the other thing that's very scary is those fines, those what they charge you to put on the anchor monitor. I have somebody, I took them from work release yesterday. They're in work release, they in jail. They put them on the anchor monitor to go apply for a job, and they keep them in that anchor monitor in the jail. I said, sis, since you got me on, and I got to charge this in the jail, you got me, girl, like, what's it? Like, I couldn't process it. And they're paying for it. They're paying rent in prisons and jails. And it leads me to, we have to stop letting these things be line items in the budgets and how these cities live. Because as an executive director that lives off of a budget, if it's in the line item, you're going to make sure it stays. You're going to make sure that it increases the next year. Yeah. So cash bail is really important. But this idea of people who are navigating the injustice system, whether they're youth or adult, being a way that we infuse money into our communities needs to be removed, because as long as that exists, they will perpetuate that harm and perpetuate it on the most poor folks in our communities that then are positioned to do what they got to do to pay the fine. So I just it's kind of this hamster's wheel of oppression attached to dollars, and that's very dangerous. So if we do away with that, that's a great starting place.
And I think one of the ways we do that is we get involved. We don't sit around and wait for someone to give us the right to vote. We get involved. We do civic engagement right now. When the legislature opens, we know we can go online and see what bills are up. And we need to see which ones would affect our community and begin to offer resistance to the ones and block and hinder the ones, testimonies, mount movements and campaigns against the ones that will harm our community. And we need to get involved in real civic engagement and not wait for the shoe to drop with the next law or the bill passed or the act passed and then wonder how we got here, right? So I just want to say thank you, all of you amazing panelists, for joining us today. I know that it is time for closing. We have been so blessed by your wisdom and your brilliance. I would like to remind everybody that hashtag Equity is Justice will be hosting another panel on October 14th on Pell and universal eligibility. Follow us at CCF_NY and stay posted. Don't forget to take action by using the link on your screen. Thank you all so much. Whew.
You guys were awesome.